Well, hi, I'm Joshua,
Hi, I'm Telia.
and welcome to our podcast, The Uncommon Senses, where we reflect on the nature of knowledge, on how we know what we claim to know. So, hi everyone, welcome back to our podcast. And this is going to be a follow up from our last podcast where we talk about synesthesia and also how our five different senses work together in creating a whole experience for us. So, from our last podcast, you can see that synesthesia is truly an amazing phenomenon where a crossover of various senses could actually give rise to new ones. I mean, just how amazing is that? But however, this is not the sense that exists outside of our usual five senses. I'm sure you all heard about the term, sixth sense, a phrase used to describe some kind of implicit perception from some unknown source by some unknown mechanism. And some people would describe it as intuition or instincts, while others would refer it as the superhuman ability to communicate with paranormals, while others may simply dismiss it as fiction or deny its existence at all. But as you will soon discover, our sixth sense is actually very real. The sixth sense I'm going to introduce first, much like synesthesia, is only possessed by a small group of people, and it is actually echolocation, which describes the ability to detect one's environment through sensing the echoes bouncing off of surrounding objects, and is present in written records as early as 1749, when French philosopher Denis Diderot recorded a blind friend being able to navigate his surroundings through sounds. This sense emerged due to its extraordinary ability for people who have no vision to have heightened sense of hearing, kind of like a superpower. But however fictional it might sound, it is actually backed by a lot of scientific reasoning and evidence, which scientists attribute to a phenomenon known as neuroplasticity. Tali, have you heard of this term like neuroplasticity? I still can't pronounce it.
I guess it's kind of like, the term plasticity is kind of like, the brain is kind of rewired or is kind of like different than our own.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. The term describes, our ability for our human brain to rewire or restructure its synapses to adapt to its environmental factors. So, in other words, our brain can actually change and adapt itself according to our surroundings, which, it's kind of a bizarre concept to think about it because we can't really feel our brain changing while it does all the time. And if you don't believe me, you can actually test out yourself. All you need is a desk divider, a reasonably realistic rubber hand, and a hammer, and another person as your test subject. And this is a test actually called the rubber hand experiment. To do this, you tell the subject to put his or her hand on one side of the desk divider so the person could see his or her own hand. But the rubber hand on the other Put the rubber hand on the other side of the desk divider, which is visible to this test subject. Then you'll simultaneously stroke the rubber hand and the person's hand instinct for around 2 to 3 minutes. And what is happening now is that you're actually fooling the subject brain to think that the rubber hand is actually their own real hand, which their brain is rewiring temporarily to adopt the rubber band as its own. Then unexpectedly, take your hammer out and smash it onto the rubber hand. And you'll a interesting phenomenon you will see is that the subjects will actually jump back in fear as they think that you're actually attacking their real hand instead. So to these to see this experiment, I recommend watching a BBC documentary called Horizon, which is linked in the descriptions below. And now back to the topic of echolocation. It is not just a skill possessed by particular human beings, but it's actually a prominent mode of sensing in the animal kingdom. So usually you see in animals such as bats, blue whales, or dolphins, um, which are animals that can echolocate, and this helps them to navigate their dark environment, such as the night sky or pitch black ocean seafloor, where no light can actually penetrate. So, it is actually a quite an extraordinary central equipment for animals that can normally couldn't really sense their surroundings through normal vision. And sixth sense that we're going to talk about is also used by many animals, and one of the most famous examples being bees, um, known as the known for building complex colonies. Bees are intensely social insects, and they rely on communication and job delegation to carry out their impressive scale of coordination, in terms of building their hives and also collecting nectar and producing honey. But the question is, how do they talk to each other, so to speak? They're not like human beings. They don't really have a verbal language, so to speak. So as it turns out, bees release a kind of chemical known as pheromones, which are substances that almost all animals release and carry around to transfer information and to give instructions. And human beings are no different, being social animals ourselves. And subconsciously and quite unknowingly, we release these pheromones and chemicals every day through sweat, odor, saliva, breath, even urine, and other bodily discharge. And so, as it turns out, we receive pheromones through specialized sensory neurons in our nose and our mouth, which affects one's perceived attractiveness, mood, and other social interaction. So, like, for example, like, have you ever been enchanted by a person's musk or scent? Which now I read is kind of kind of a weird thing to say, but I mean, it's supposedly this is backed by scientific evidence and phenomenon. So like, Telia, have you ever like find a particular scent of a person to be attractive
Oh,
or
wow.
like disgusting?
Well, I just remember there's one time we were like, basically it happened in our school, and like there was this teacher, and then she wears this perfume which is like we all kind of think it's
I
too
think I
strong.
know who you're talking about.
Yeah. Like, I mean, this is, this pheromones thing can definitely be related to like, the smell, like as like one of our five senses. But I think, it's very interesting because like pheromone, this kind of thing, it's similar to like smell, but it's also very different because subjectively speaking, it's a perfume, so it's like not supposed to smell that bad, but then you just kind of strongly have this repulsion against it. Like, it's just not attractive. Like, it's just weird. Or there's some smells that it just you can't explain why it smells good. You just feel like that smells really good. Like, for example, your grandma, like sometimes you kind of there's this term like elderly scent or whatever, and I think it's just, yeah, going to my grandma's just makes me, there's just that that sense of like comfort. Like, I don't know how to explain it, and there's a very specific smell for like our grandmas.
I think it's very interesting you talked about like the grandma or supposedly like elderly smell that people often smell around old people. And it's very interesting because recently I had this conversation with my dad about like, why do old people have a particular kind of smell? And I went online, I did some research, and apparently it's because of not to pop your bubble, but it's because of like a deteriorating skin condition, where like because as we age, our skin loses oxidants. So like the lipid cells under our skin actually gets oxidized, and this actually produced a chemical that can create like an elderly musk, so to speak. So yeah, so it's I guess like to some people it represents comfort because it's the signature smell of their grandpa and grandma, and we attach specific memories to smells and different sensual experiences. And to other people it may be like, oh, they think it's stinky and it's a kind of like a repulsive kind of mechanism. So I think it's very interesting to see how pheromones could both attract and repulse people. And I also find it very interesting how you mentioned about perfumes and perhaps like deodorants, these kind of chemicals we put on our bodies to kind of hide our smell. And to some extent, do you think it's really kind of like we are kind of messing with nature in the sense that we're manipulating our own pheromones, or we're actively blocking our own pheromones to achieve certain social conventions or social goals, such as like, we put cologne on ourselves to make us seem more attractive, or we put like deodorant to hide our sweat smells to make us seem less repulsive and to tell people, hey, I'm not dirty. So do you think, it's a good or a bad thing that, we are actually in our modern age, we are using chemicals to manipulate our pheromones or manipulate our bodily odors in order to, essentially fit into society?
I don't think I don't want to say it's necessarily good or bad, but it's just very interesting that there's a social expectation of what we should smell, and like also a biological thing of the chemicals that we release. Yeah, I think it's just, a balance between like this kind of like social construct of what smells good, and like hence we have like inventions of, deodorants and perfumes and stuff like that. And it's definitely interesting like how much our scent, plays a very strong role in like our interpersonal relationships with other people, and like impressions that other people have on us. Yeah, I think. Oh yeah, another thing I wanted to add for this sixth sense idea is the echolocation that you mentioned about. I think in our class we also talked about like there's this person who has echolocation. I think he's blind, and then he can't, but then he uses echolocation to ride bicycles around, to know that where the obstacles are. Like literally, he just makes sounds with like sounds,
Yeah.
and then basically, yeah, like clicking sound, and then he is able to know where the trees are. I think echolocation being possessed by like humans is, it's just really fascinating. And yeah, this particular sixth sense, I guess.
Yeah, and it's also very like interesting to see like just how flexible, as you mentioned, like the echolocation, like how flexible our brains are. Like I'm not sure if that person is, I forgot, is that person blind, before he was born or after he was born? I forgot, but it's very interesting to see how just in a very short period of time the human brain is able to quickly rewire itself to adapt to its environment, while for example in other features, for example like for bats or dolphins or other animals, it may take them hundreds or millions of years just to evolve to where they are. So I guess it's a very it's a very fascinating point to note how just how flexible our brains are, and how the echolocation serves as a very compelling evidence for such. And it's very funny because when you mentioned about another person having echolocation, the first person I thought of was like Helen Keller. So like
Okay.
but then when you said he, I quickly was, oh, I was wrong. But speaking of Helen Keller, she also have a very exceptional, unusual sense, or like sixth sense, so to speak, which is tactioception, which is when people who are blind have a more enhanced tactile sense, so they have better sensitivity. They have better sensitivity towards the surroundings that they touch, essentially. Not only does a disability kind of changes how a person senses their surroundings, but actually a person's profession could also enhances one's sense. For example, professional athletes or people working in the circus, they have something called a proprioception or a equilibrioception, which are kind of six senses they developed because of their the needs of their occupation. So for the first one that we're going to talk about is proprioception, which is the body's ability to sense its surrounding and to sense action and location without visual aids. So for example, it is the you can even do this little experiments at home. It is the ability where you're able to touch your nose or kick your feet without looking. So it's basically the kind of like a muscle sensory response. So you can kind of like be able to feel your body and feel your bodily movements. The other one is equilibrioception, which is the sense of balance, where because of a controlled vestibular system, which is located in your inner ear. So essentially, it provides you um, hints and information about, are you hints and information about, are you standing straight, or are you like having a balanced action. And conflict of these senses could actually cause disabilities and causes ailments such as motion sickness. So that's a practical example of when these senses that we don't really focus on malfunctions, it can
Mm-hmm.
actually like produce like disabilities, and actually like limit our actions and limit our activity. So you may say that all these six senses we have covered so far only cover like they kind of, one way or another, they relate to our five senses, such as
Mm-hmm.
echolocation. Ultimately, they also rely on auditory senses, and pheromones relies on olfactory or gustatory senses. So you may say that, oh, I don't really think that these senses are as new, so to speak, because one way or another they also feed into our other five senses. So you may ask, are there other senses that are completely detached? They do not rely on our current five senses at all. And to that I say, of course they are. For instance, there's a kind of sense called magnetoreception. Oh my gosh, all these names are driving me crazy. Which is
It's all right.
which is the power to unconsciously detect changes in the Earth's magnetic field to navigate directions. So scientists have found that the mechanism relies on our nervous system, which consists of gravity, temperature, pain, balance, and several other internal stimuli. Many organisms rely on this ability, from bacteria to birds and fishes, to kind of sense their surrounding area and navigate accordingly. Dr. Schulman, a postdoctoral researcher, even tried to amplify and put this sense into use by his invention of the haptic compass belt. Essentially, the belt vibrates in the direction of north constantly, allowing the users to navigate his or her direction simply by feeling it. So like essentially they could like feel their direction. And even though this is a seemingly artificial equipment or artificial tool, they would argue that it opens a new sense to people, so they could like sense their direction, while normal people couldn't. So Talia, I would like to ask, like, would you like to own an invention like that, an invention that allows you to feel your direction without consulting maps or like other directory tools?
Oh God, I mean that would be great actually, because I don't know where I'm going most of the time. I don't really know the direction or anything. But like yeah, like what you mentioned just now, there's like modern technology like Google Maps. Like they're basically doing a very similar thing to that. And um so yeah, my answer to your question is like yes, but no, because there's Google Maps and all of these tools anyway. But I think that's also very interesting because modern days we kind of somewhat need this. Like we don't have that much of like a better sense in directions, but we kind of like discuss like our ancestors or like more primitive like tribes. Do they have like a better sense in like direction? Because you know when people just kind of people like of an older generation just tell me this is go to northeast, go to like southwest, and I'm like what where, and I'm just kind of confused. So back in their days when they don't have these kind of modern technology, then do they actually have a better sense of direction because they simply have to, like in terms of survival needs, like they have to, know these directions more specifically than us. So, and also, yeah, just basically there's a relationship between like technology and also like our sense of direction. I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, and I think from what you said, I think it reminds me of this Chinese proverb, which I think comes aptly into its place now. Is that like this saying where it's like some people have high grade but low abilities. So is this so is this idea that now, as compared to our ancestors, nowadays people focus, they focus more of their time in front of a screen, in front of in a classroom, or in a work, a office environment. They have less use of their senses, so to speak, because they're not in the wild. They don't need to forage for food, or hunt, or to create their own homes. And yeah, and I think I think it relates to what you said about how technology, or like our modern way of lifestyle, actually largely limits how we use our senses. And maybe from a long-term neglect of our senses could lead to a deterioration of our central abilities. And another thing you
Mm-hmm.
reminded me of is that in our modern age, we're constantly bombarded with different stimuli. For example, from as we talked about just now, billboards of fast food chains. They use this really eye-catching colors, for example, like red, or like really flashy visual aids to kind of tempt us into eating, or tempting us into consuming. So there's also this idea that the overstimulation, or the constant bombardment of external stimulation of our senses, could essentially causes us to be more numb, or cause our
Mm-hmm.
central abilities to deteriorate. So I think it is a combination of these different factors compounded together that causes us to be worse than our ancestors, so to speak, in terms of the department of senses. And
Mm-hmm.
also, like, I think in at least from our culture, the Chinese culture, our ancestors are very good at sensing something like the weather, or like the natural environments, because I think they rely on these senses in farming and in the yield of crops. A bad weather could just mean could be the meaning between getting fed and starving. So, but nowadays, because of the global supply chain and how our food gets imported, and we don't really need to rely on these kind of primal instincts um to ensure our own survival anymore. So I think there's also this kind of shift in again, the shift in lifestyle, and the shift in the the what our civilization relies on in production, and what it relies on surviving. I think this also plays a large role in how um, a large role in how our senses have developed, and how our senses has, like, the condition of our senses. So I think what this proves, it illustrates, is that neuroplasticity, on one hand, it could aid us to develop new senses that arise because of new specific needs. But on the other hand, it can also play a role in having some eliminating, so to speak, useless senses that we don't really need to use anymore in our day-to-day life. So
Yeah.
yeah, now we talked a lot about how how technology could limit our senses, and how an over reliance on technology can essentially bring about the downfall of our central abilities. And yeah, now I just would like just to give some examples of how technology could, on the other hand, also enhance our senses. So, for example, there's this person called Neil Harabison, who is cyborg artist from Spain, who became the first person to have an antenna implanted into his skull. So this allowed him to have senses normally unavailable to humans, such as receiving electromagnetic radiation, phone calls, or even data from satellites. And there was even an entire art movement in the 2000s dedicated to this sort of thing, the creation of new senses through technology, which is called cyborgism. And from that, they have this organization named the Cyborg Foundation, which you can research yourself to see many other examples of how different cyborg artists was able to manipulate or invent new technology in order to enhance their ability to sense their surroundings. So as you can see, the shift in paradigm, or the advancement of technology, essentially brought about the creation of new senses, and perhaps even go as far as saying that it has redefined our definition of what senses are. So when you ask a person, maybe like 100 or 200 years ago, they would say that, oh, senses are purely confined within our five senses, the sense of touch, the sense of taste, the sense of smell, and so on. But, with the emergence of technology and with the accumulation of education and knowledge we have now, we actually have a better understanding of the existence of new senses as well as the knowledge of how to create new ones. So, there's definitely a lot of, a lot of space for you to think about. Like, is the ability to create new senses a good thing, or are we, um, a good thing, or are we, playing God, or causing our, older or more primal senses to deteriorate in its function? So, yeah, Talia, would you like, I see that you don't really see the, point of owning a belt that tells you directions, but would you like to be someone like Neil, who essentially, implant technology within their internal body, so to like receive, completely, unnatural senses to adapt to our, 21st century surroundings, where you can, receive phone calls or have Wi-Fi or receive data from satellites?
Oh my god, I think that for me now that sounds a little bit creepy and crazy. So possibly no, but like I do get like, times are evolving and like we are changing. And yeah, I think that's like a very interesting thing between like nature versus mankind, that thing. And I think we're possibly going to talk a little bit more about that in like the future episodes where we talk about reality and like this hypothesis that our world might be a simulation. I think we are going to discuss more about that in future episodes, and I think it's really fun. And yeah, I think in going back to the question of implanting new, so-called senses in our own body, I think just right now it doesn't really seem very ethical to me. It's just I personally won't really do that because I think there possibly is a reason why we have evolved with these senses and like a hierarchy of which senses are the most important than the other. Like we have lived for so long and we have come to this place because of accumulation for like years of evolution. But I do understand that technology is evolving way faster than human beings evolution, basically. I guess. Yeah, so I think it's just this person made this particular choice with his senses, but I feel like I don't know, maybe in the future we don't need these technologies anymore. A new set of technology is going to evolve, like this idea of receiving phone calls, because we don't really make phone calls anymore. We just text each other and stuff like that. Yeah, and we have different medias like Zoom, like we can see people while making phone calls and stuff. So yeah, if it's for me, I possibly wouldn't do that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people actually agree with you on that. I think to them it's a very creepy, or like they think it's a rather unsettling idea to have technology implanted in us. And you hear a lot of the same arguments with the emergence of artificial organs. People don't really want putting machineries inside the body, and there are also other safety concerns about what if the mechanism malfunction, will that affect my health? And I think it just has a lot to do with like the paradigm that we're in now. I don't think we're even with the the dramatic shift in technology, and even with its ability to do so, I don't think mainstream society is really equipped or ready to accept these kinds of new equipments in their life. And as we've seen in history, new technologies, new ideas takes a long time to integrate into mainstream perception, into mainstream idea. So definitely I think the same goes for like introducing new senses, and the idea that our ability to accept um our ability to accept whether we want to have new senses based on the integration of technology with our bodily functions. So yeah, so that's basically the main idea for this extended episode from our first episode, where essentially the idea is that we want the public to think more than just the normal five senses we have now, and to accept the idea that there are extraordinary, seemingly fictional senses other than our normal sense of touch, sense of taste, and sense of smell, and all the other ones. So yeah, we hope that we have introduced some new senses that you've never thought of before and given you some room for thought. And of course, there are still many senses out there that we didn't cover, like dollars and senses, or the census as the population survey. And if you didn't laugh at that joke, you clearly don't have a sense of humor. So thank you so much for listening to our podcast. And in the next episode, we're going to talk more about how our senses affect the way we obtain knowledge and construct the reality around us. So please keep an eye out for new episodes, and we'll see you next time on The Uncommon Senses.